Well, hello and welcome to another Diving Deeper from Longfleet Baptist Church. My name's Ken, I'm the minister, and today I'm joined by Chris, who's...
Hi, Ken.
Hi, Chris, you're one of the leaders at Parkstone Baptist Church.
Yeah, that's right.
And we have quite close links between our two churches, and every month when there's 5 Sundays, on the 5th Sunday we have a joint service. So we did that yesterday, end of May, and Chris very kindly invited us along to Parkstone Baptist Church, and you are beginning to explore the book of Acts, aren't you, in your church?
Yeah, we haven't started yet. We actually start next week.
Yeah.
We have spent quite a long time in John's Gospel, so we thought we'd just turn the page from the Gospel to Acts. But then when we realised when we looked at the beginning of Acts, the person who wrote the book talks about a previous book that they'd written, and because we think it was Luke who wrote Acts, that's what sent us back to that previous book, which is Luke's Gospel. So
yeah.
We thought we'd take a quick,
wasn't it?
Yeah. A bit too quick overview of as much of Luke's Gospel as we could in one Sunday, and you very kindly offered to be up for that.
So Chris took us on an express tour through Luke on Sunday, and you asked us to look at 3 things as we considered both Luke and Acts, really, didn't you?
Yeah.
What were those 3 things you wanted us to consider?
Yeah, so in looking over Luke's Gospel, the 3 things were to get a sense of the story, the kind of overall story that Luke wanted to tell, particularly about Jesus, because his Gospel is about Jesus. And then 2 other slightly different things, to keep a track of all the people who had encounters with Jesus, whose lives were transformed, to see if we could find any similarities and differences between them. And then something even a little bit more left field, which is all the times Luke mentions food.
Yeah.
Often people gathering around food to share a meal together, either by invitation or just wanting to be together. But also times when food gets a mention, so they're not necessarily eating, but food is in the conversation or the teaching.
Yeah. And in fact, Jesus had so many meals with people that the Pharisees called him a glutton and a drunk, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. And why are you always eating with sinners and tax collectors?
Yeah.
So it seems that it was very rare you could find the right crowd to eat with as far as the Pharisees were concerned. But sometimes we were looking yesterday, weren't we, that he had meals with Pharisees as well. And you'd have thought, oh, okay, he's with the in crowd, but those didn't go so well either.
No. Both, so as you said, Luke and Acts, almost certainly, 99.9% written by the same guy, Luke. Luke, the physician in Paul's letters, a companion of Paul later on in Paul's journeys. I mean, some people even think that it was one book originally and then split in 2.
Yes.
And both of these books are dedicated to an individual called Theophilus or Theophilus, God lover.
Yeah.
But who or what do you think Theophilus is?
Well, I think the best place to start is we're not 100% sure, and probably way less sure than we are about Luke being the author of both these books. And we pondered a bit, I think, didn't we, yesterday, as to whether this was someone's real name, and so it was an early believer in Jesus that Luke was writing to and whose name was Theophilus, or perhaps given that picking out and singling out someone at that point, given all the opposition that Jesus faced that Luke records in his Gospel, and then that the early church faced when he wrote the book of Acts, maybe he used a false name, a pseudonym, to kind of conceal the identity of the person. And what a great pseudonym to pick, lover of God, for a person's name. But then we pondered whether it might actually be more a general term for all sorts of people who want to get to know God better and believe that the best way to do that is through getting to know Jesus. And so Theophilus, in a sense, becomes all of us, all the people that read Luke's Gospel and the book of Acts.
Yeah. And you mentioned that yesterday, and I really liked that actually, and I'd heard it before, but I hadn't really sort of considered it, and the idea that Theophilus is all Christians, all lovers of God. Although I like it, I suspect that's not it. I think probably it was a person or people in Rome. So the Acts ends with Paul under arrest in Rome. And I suspect the book of Acts was written very late, possibly even or published, if you like, after Paul's death. And there is a person in Rome who wants to know what is this all about, or possibly a church in Rome. So I I do really like the idea that Luke is writing to all Christians, and I think we can own that. Theophilus is all of us.
Yeah.
But I suspect that what he actually meant was a person or a church in Rome who were just wondering about Paul, who is this crazy guy that's arrived in Rome? We know about Jews, but we don't know about these people that are eating and drinking the body and blood of their God. You know, what on earth is going on? And Luke has this diary, if you like, that he's just, well, more than a diary, much more than a diary, but he's been recording everything, and he finally puts it down, and the information's there. And amazing that 2,000 years later, we still have it.
Oh, isn't it a gift?
Yeah.
And in many ways, that's like other bits in the New Testament, isn't it? Especially the letters that were written to whole churches or to individuals. We don't look at those and think, oh, that's just interesting history. We take stuff away for us. So even though I'm sure you're right, Theophilus could have been an individual at the time, or a group of people, a community. There's so much for us to take away.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that leads us on to our next question, a fairly technical question, I suppose. What was Luke's source of information? Because you briefly mentioned that yesterday. So where did Luke get all this material from that he was able to put in these two books?
I think we could have spent a chunk of time on that, really, didn't we?
Yeah.
I mean, it was very much just a little intro bit of our flyby. What intrigued us, I'll just read out some verses from the beginning of Luke, if that's all right. Luke starts his gospel off talking about his sources. Luke writes, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word." And then he says, "With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus." There's that name. And we were really intrigued by the sense of who these eyewitnesses, and then this other phrase Luke uses, servants of the word, and just who that might be. And it made us think that, I think it's true to say that in times gone by, one of the thoughts was that Mark, one of the other gospel writers who contributed, I think what's the shortest of the four gospels, could have been that servant of the word, and so the writer of the original gospel, because there's no doubt, just as there is in Matthew, for Luke and Mark, there's quite a lot of overlap. We mentioned, my wife and I do this thing called the Mark drama, and so we've got Mark's gospel very much in our head, where we act out the whole of that gospel in 90 minutes. And there's lots of overlap. When you read through Luke, you're thinking, oh yeah, that's in Mark, that's in Mark. But of course that makes the things that Luke adds or puts in a different context or sequence stand out all the more, I think. I believe, sort of more recent understanding is that perhaps Mark and Luke were drawing on a separate source, but that was common to them both, and perhaps Matthew too, as something that a group of gospel writers would have had possession of. I think it's often referred to as the Q source, an account, not necessarily gospel as we know it, but an account of what Jesus did that formed the foundation for what, and then those three, what we call synoptic gospels, with the same view of Jesus, used as part of that key source. So that's perhaps that. So
scholars today think of this sort of Q, the Q source. And whether that was written, or whether it was an oral tradition, whether it was people or a person, and it seems that the three synoptic gospels share that. My thought, and I like to sort of, I really like imagining these people. I really like to get into the lives of these people, Luke and Paul and Mary and Joseph and all that. And I suspect that Luke was a popular guy in the Jerusalem church. Maybe before Paul was on the scene, or maybe much later. Like I said, Paul ends up in Jerusalem and then goes to Rome. So he does visit Jerusalem with Luke. I think this Q source, whether it was Mark, whether it was something else, Luke has this. I think so. I want to know a bit more. I want to know, did that really happen to Mary? And he goes and finds Mary in the Jerusalem church, and he sits down over over a glass of wine or whatever it was. What did the angel say to you, and what did those shepherds say when they arrived? And Peter, did this really happen the way I've heard it happen? And I just, maybe that's my imagination running away with things, but I think that Luke, he said, I set about writing an orderly account of things, and I think whatever the source was that he uses, I think he has one-on-one conversations with the people that were involved. Maybe that's totally heretical.
No, I reckon you're right, and I think that goes to that other thing that Luke mentions at the beginning about these eyewitnesses.
Yes, absolutely.
Because there are things that Luke records, and many of which are unique to Luke's gospel, aren't they? That you kind of think, well, there's such a small, if not just one person other than Jesus who could have known that happened. I mean, all the richness of the account that Luke has around the time of the birth of Jesus, that relationship with her cousin Elizabeth, and her husband Zechariah, the parents of John the Baptist, those meetings, the encounters with the angel, where those stories could have been told, but the way Luke tells them, I can imagine he would want to go back to the original source. So I think those sit-down conversations with all sorts of people would have been the ways that Luke then built on the foundation, whether that was Mark, whether that was the Q document, or a mix of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just shows the amount of work that Luke must have put into it. And over decades, I think this is probably, he began to write, very soon after the crucifixion, and maybe finished 50, 60 years later. So no one really knows when Luke Acts was written, but I suspect it was 80, 90, late, but late for a gospel.
And that would make total sense if, as you say, they were one book. Because obviously Acts is that retrospective look at a whole span of time, and so that late time frame, post Paul's imprisonment in Rome, would make total sense. And then the final question for today is, Luke's gospel has been called the social gospel. And why do you think that is? And you've asked us to look at people in it, and that kind of hints to why it's called the social gospel. I think so. I think the two things we asked everyone to look at before our flyby or flyover was people who had encounters with Jesus and any common threads to their stories we could identify, and then all these occasions around food. And there's social in both aspects there, isn't there? So for people, what struck us, particularly as we took a little bit of time to pause when Jesus was in the synagogue in Nazareth, in I think it's Luke 4, where Jesus is in his hometown, his home community, and reading from the scroll of Isaiah and talking about that come to preach good news for the poor, release of freedom for the captives, sight for the blind, and then says, this prophecy now is being fulfilled right now in him, in Jesus. That sense of just who these people were, the captives, the poor, I think has a wider meaning than just those two words perhaps conjure up for us at first read. So it's not just people who are economically poor or people imprisoned, but people whose lives were constrained by various parts of their background or diseases they might have had, and so whose lives were impoverished because of that, because they couldn't have social contact with others because of diseases they were suffering from, or possession, the things that Luke records. It would have put many of these people in that long list that your son Nat very kindly recorded for us as we went along, into what we would call the fringes of society, who weren't people in the centre. And that's not to say the other gospel writers don't pick up on people like that. They do, because there's that overlap we talked about, but Luke even more so. So many of that long list that we had on the whiteboard are people who it would be easy to say were proper excluded from society. So that sense of care for them, of Jesus saying that I'm here for you, and he goes on to say in the synagogue in Nazareth, isn't it, that it wasn't just any widow that came forth, but a widow who was even more excluded by her background. It wasn't just any leper who was healed, but a leper who was even more excluded by his background. Jesus just emphasising, I am here for the people on the margins. They are the poor, they are the captives that Isaiah was talking about.
I've spoken before about how when people come to faith, they're drawn into community, and that's one of the marks, I think, of Christian, of a Christian, is that you're drawn into a Christian community, and we certainly see that in Jesus in Luke, and with his disciples and the apostles in Acts. They want to draw these people on the fringes into their community, and if I use the word religion, you kind of know what I mean. Our religion cannot just be an isolated spiritual thing. It's got to have this social element to it, this justice element to it, and you can't just be all sort of super spiritual and not then have the Spirit give you the desire to want to be a social, both in terms of getting out there being social, but also the social responsibility that Christians have, a social duty, and Luke portrays that. And a physician, a doctor, you would think that that's where it comes from his heart, doesn't it? His own desire is to serve and to heal and to make well. Yes, understandable that is the part of Jesus that he particularly wants to hone in on. But he doesn't separate the social from the spiritual. He has them both, and he relates his gospel back to the Old Testament, to the prophecies and things. They're all there. It's really important that it's grounded in these prophecies.
Oh, so much so, and for us, because Parkstone Baptist Church, looking at Luke is a stepping stone to us going into that second book, Acts. One of the questions the disciples posed to the risen Jesus before he ascended was, "Have you come to restore the kingdom to Israel?"
Yeah.
And it's one of those moments, and this comes up a lot in the gospel. We found it in John's gospel as well, where Jesus doesn't give an immediate or straight answer. In fact, what he says is he talks about, wait here in Jerusalem, but actually you will be my witnesses here in Jerusalem, in the neighbouring territories of Judea and Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth.
Yeah.
And the whole of Acts follows that structure, doesn't it? Of the gospel moving out and crossing boundaries.
Yeah.
So this focus that Luke has on reaching people out on the margins, the fringes, is another one of those boundary crossing moments, isn't it? It's reaching out and just saying, we don't put walls around our community as church. We have open borders, open spaces, around this community. And that's hugely challenging for us to say, well, what does that mean, God? And how do we behave in that way? Who are our paralysed man? Who are our people with leprosy? Who are our people who are there on the margins?
Yeah, we could probably talk for the whole day on Luke and Acts. It's fascinating. You can see we're both really excited about it, and I do hope that you've benefited from this diving deeper. And that you want to go and look at the book of Acts and Gospel of Luke, the social gospel, and find out what God says to you through this amazing man who wrote 2,000 years ago, wrote so carefully and so diligently, and amazing that we still have it today. What a gift, as you said. Completely. So our prayer for you is that you would know something of the gospel that Luke wants you to know. So, thank you, Chris. God bless.
Thank you, Ken.